Well, welcome everyone to this special bonus episode of Daily Dose of Aramaic. And you may remember it was about a year and a half ago when Daily Dose of Aramaic launched. And since that time, since the very first video, we have taught through my textbook, Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters. And we've gone from Daniel 2:4, and right now we're in Daniel 6, working our way through the Biblical Aramaic corpus verse by verse. Well, today we're celebrating a new milestone, and that is the 1,000th YouTube subscriber. So I thought, what better way to celebrate this than to invite on our program, Dr. Frederick Greenspahn. He is the author of the first, at least widely available, teaching grammar of Biblical Aramaic. It's called An Introduction to Aramaic, published first in 1999. Its corrected second edition came out in 2007, and maybe some viewers would be familiar with that so far, but most would not know that a Korean version was translated and came out in 2012. Very exciting. So Dr. Greenspahn graduated with his PhD from Brandeis in 1977, writing on Hapax Legomena in Biblical Hebrew, which was subsequently published by the Society of Biblical Literature, and republished recently by Wipf and Stock in 2016. Altogether, he's written and edited 16 books, and the most recent is an edited volume, Classic Essays in Biblical History, that came out in 2019. He's a past president of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew, and he's Gimel Stab Eminent Scholar of Judaic Studies at Florida Atlantic University. He presently lives in Denver, and we are thrilled to be able to have an interview with him today. Welcome, Dr. Greenspahn.
Thank you very much.
So it is truly exciting to be able to talk with you. Well, so let's dive right in, shall we?
Sure.
Okay. So many of our viewers would be interested to find out about this. Could you please share what led you to become an academic in the field of biblical studies?
Certainly, it was a long and involved process. Like many people, when I was an adolescent, I was curious about my religion in general and mine in particular. And I made the very misguided assumption that the way to understand anything is to find out how it began. I learned many years later from Wilfred Cantwell Smith, a professor at Harvard, that that's the mistake of thinking you can understand oak trees by studying acorns. So I wanted to start out with the Bible, and along the way had encouragement from a variety of teachers. I think oftentimes, as I reflect back, teachers don't realize the influence they have, oftentimes because we don't realize it at the time, and
Yes.
It's only looking back. So it was my advisor as an undergraduate, then a professor I had at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who showed me the Bible was far more complicated than I had realized. An
Yes.
instructor at the Hebrew Union College who encouraged me. He told me I was going to have to choose between if I wanted to study the Bible and how it originated, or rather how it developed. I didn't know I was going to end up doing both. And then at Brandeis, Nachum Sarna, who was very supportive and ultimately responsible for much that I ended up doing. So I feel very much like his student and disciple, though I think at the time, while he was alive, I didn't realize how deeply he had affected me. So it was a journey that led me all along the way.
Well, I think probably many of our viewers can identify with much of what you just said. Well, can you now, based on that, share with us a sketch, basically, of your academic career, especially highlighting for us the parts that involve studying the biblical languages?
Certainly. And there again, it was a journey. When I got my doctorate, as is often the case, I was having a hard time finding a job. So I ended up as an adjunct at Assumption College, a Catholic college in Worcester, Massachusetts, and then also taught a class at Brandeis. When I came to the University of Denver after that, I had an appointment first in Jewish studies, and then because of the complicated politics of that arrangement, also in religious studies. And as part of that, I wanted to teach or to run really a summer Hebrew class, because it became clear to me there were a variety of constituencies that didn't really learn Hebrew very well. On the one hand, Jewish community where they learned to read Hebrew but not to understand it. On the other hand, there was a liberal Protestant, an evangelical Protestant, and a Catholic seminary where they could barely read Hebrew at all.
Yes.
And so I put together a summer class where we were going to teach Hebrew in 10 weeks. And obviously, given the constituency, it had to focus on the Bible. And so I found a book. It's called The First Hebrew Primer, which focuses on biblical Hebrew, but it manages to do it in a very short order, and by focusing primarily on one book of the Bible. And given that we had 10 weeks, it was very appropriate that the book they chose was the book of Ruth, which is A, prose, B, a wonderful story, and C, very short.
Yes.
And in order to serve all the constituencies, we needed two teachers. So on the one hand, we had a person who could explain the grammar of Hebrew. But on the other hand, we needed somebody who could actually read it, because I learned very quickly from this experience that on the one hand, Jews don't learn grammar and Christians don't learn how to read. So my goal was to help both groups. The course went for several years and was quite successful. And I guess I was doing some sort of interfaith relations at the same time without reading, because we had the grammar teacher who was outstanding. He'd come from the University of Chicago, and he knew biblical Hebrew grammar inside and out. But we also had an Israeli who could read it and speak it. And I hope the students would gain both skills, because I learned, again, Jews oftentimes don't understand the grammar of Hebrew. They just learn phrases, kind of a Berlitz method. And Christians, I learned, oftentimes at that time couldn't read it out loud. That's all changed, I have to say, and it's changed very much for the better. The University of Denver and the Iliff School of Theology, which was right next door, decided to create a joint program in religious studies, one track of which would be in Bible. So it was a PhD program. And in the course of that, I ended up teaching Aramaic, Hebrew, Ugaritic, and Akkadian at different times. And that led to an invitation from the Society of Biblical Literature, which had a very strong presence on the university and Iliff's campuses, to invite me to write a Aramaic textbook for them. And so I used the Hebrew textbook that we had used in that class as the model, because when I learned Aramaic, the book that was used was by Franz Rosenthal, who is an expert in Aramaic, but has no idea of how to write a textbook. And so it's a wonderful reference book, but pedagogically it was very poor. So that's what led to the textbook. When I moved to Florida in the year 2004, they didn't know quite where to put me, and I ended up in a language department. And I was struck by the fact that, as I mentioned with Rosenthal, I was being invited to review, for the Religious Studies Review, a series of biblical Hebrew textbooks. And they were horrible, pedagogically.
Yes.
Again, they were wonderful in terms of their knowledge of the language, but for teaching purposes, I thought they were horrible. And I was struck, especially as I reflected on it, about how different textbooks in biblical Hebrew are from textbooks for other languages. When I took Latin in high school, when I took German in college. And so I wrote a piece for SBL in 2015 called Why Hebrew Textbooks Are Different from Those for Other Languages, and actually was able to consult with colleagues in my department, because this was the language department. They taught Spanish, they taught Italian, French, German, whatever. And they had experts in how you teach a foreign language. And that piece gathered more attention than anything else I've ever written, maybe with the exception of the Aramaic textbook, and led a colleague by the name of Paul Overland, who teaches at Ashland Seminary, to write a series of textbooks on biblical Hebrew, which treat it as a living language.
Yes.
And so, as I said, my Aramaic textbook had that goal, and I'm very impressed with what Paul Overland has done in terms of trying to make biblical Hebrew a more well-learned language. So understanding the Bible isn't a matter of decoding.
Yes.
It's a matter of really treating it as a living language, even though I understand nobody today speaks biblical Hebrew, except maybe
Right.
Paul Overland.
Right. Wow. Wow. Well, that's really interesting and quite a journey. And obviously there was a lot of opportunity to reflect deeply on the teaching of original languages of the Bible. So given that, you touched on your textbook and bringing in these insights that you gathered from your colleagues and so forth. So can you say specifically, perhaps, what needs did you seek to fill and what original contributions did you seek to make as you wrote an introduction to Aramaic?
Sure. My goal was to teach Aramaic, or make it possible to teach Aramaic, and biblical Aramaic, obviously, in particular, in a way that would be appropriate for the students who take it.
Mm-hmm.
And those typically are going to be people, I would think, who already know biblical Hebrew to one extent or another.
Yes.
So, so it's not, teaching Aramaic if you want to move into some community where they still speak it, and there are some.
Yes.
But it rather was to assume that the students already knew biblical Hebrew and teach it in a way that they could understand. So it assumes they knew what the various conjugations, the binyanim, are. It
Yes.
assumes they know the forms in biblical Hebrew, the grammar, and so on and so forth. But secondly, my sense was that many of those students are going to have other interests as well. The corpus of biblical Aramaic is very small.
Yes.
So it's not like there's a lot of other books you can read once you know biblical Aramaic. But I wanted students to be able, using that as their base, which is what happened for me, to then go on and study Aramaic inscriptions from the ancient Near East or other ancient texts. For example, the documents from Elephantine, the Bar Kokhba documents, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Syriac, if that's the direction they're headed, and the Peshitta, if they have Old Testament interests. For other students, they could go on and read rabbinic texts and use biblical Aramaic as the base.
Yes.
It's the first step. It's not the last step. I'm not saying that the Talmud is not written in biblical Aramaic, nor are, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Or they could go on to the Targumim, again, if they're interested in Aramaic. And I suppose there are some people, probably not many, who are going to want to study modern Aramaic because it is in certain circles a living language. But again, my sense was that most students who study Aramaic already know biblical Hebrew and then use that as a launching pad for whatever direction they're going to go.
Yes, yes. Well, the first edition of your Aramaic textbook came out in 1999, publication, and the corrected second edition followed in 2007. So, as an author, I'm curious about this. I don't know about how many other people are curious, but what improvements were you able to incorporate then in the second edition?
Sure. It was a response to various issues that had been presented to me with the first edition, and also my growing awareness as I sketched my background over time of how these books are used. And I have to say, at the time, there was nothing like it.
Yes.
It's flattering to know that I think there are now a couple of competitors who have accepted the format. The book, it's my bestseller, much to my surprise.
That's great.
Not something I started out with, but it's the royalties are not huge, but they keep coming.
Right.
And as you point out, it's been translated into Korean. It has also been translated into Spanish.
Oh, okay.
And the Spanish edition, I believe, is only available online. but again, it's been a great success. The obvious corrections and changes that were possible were first to fix errors and mistakes that had emerged. Because I would remind you, when this book first came out in the late 90s, computers couldn't print Hebrew font.
Yes.
And so I don't remember the details, but I was able to download from SBL a font. And then in preparing my manuscript, I don't know what they ultimately did, but I had to type it in English characters and change the font and then print it out. And I did it in my office, which had the best computers at the time. And it would take about half an hour to print out one page. And so, each chapter would be, let's say, 5 printed pages. So what I would do is I'd have to wait till everybody went home in that office, because we shared a printer, print, push the button to print, and then I would go home and have dinner and come back 3 hours later to collect the 5 pages that had printed out. Okay, so I ended up coming back to my office like at 9 o'clock at night. At one point, I was going out with the woman that would become my wife, and so sometimes I would click print. We would go out, have a date, and then after I dropped her off at home, I would come back and collect it. So as time went on, obviously the technology changed.
Yes.
And the folks who actually were responsible for typesetting it lived a couple blocks from me. And so they were very helpful, but we were able to incorporate corrections for where there were typographical errors, where reviewers had pointed out mistakes of one kind or another. The second thing that I decided to do, and I must admit, I don't remember what led to it, but it probably was looking at other textbooks, we added an answer key. I learned along the way that some people were using this by themselves.
Yes.
They weren't in a class. And so I wanted to put in an answer key, which is now at the back of the book, so they could check themselves.
Yes.
And see, did they get the answers right? Everything in it is geared to the passages in Ezra and Daniel that are in Aramaic. But I thought they needed, just some sort of external verification.
Yes.
And I should add that we included, I can't remember in which edition, as the very last chapters, selections from other Aramaic texts based on what I thought students might become interested in. So there's a passage for one of the exercises from the Dead Sea Scrolls, a passage from an ancient inscription, a passage from a Jewish midrash. I think there's a passage from the Targum, just the same way that at the very beginning, I cite some passages from the New Testament that actually incorporate Aramaic, and a sentence from the book of Jeremiah, which in the middle of its Hebrew does exactly the same, and also Genesis. So the goal was to be user-friendly, which was the exact opposite of the Aramaic textbook I had to learn Aramaic from.
I couldn't agree more. It's exciting to hear the backstory. I didn't know that we would hear such an interesting backstory to the difference between the editions, but between you and me, Dr. Greenspahn, that is exactly the reason why I wrote my textbook, is the unfriendliness of that book you mentioned, which is what I learned from as well. So that's
Let me add, if I might, one other story.
Yes.
And this is about SBL, which had solicited the book. I mean, it's not a book that I ever planned on writing, although I guess it's going to become the most famous book I ever did. When it first came out, and it was created to fulfill a specific need, because other people sensed that, people at SBL. When it first came out, they publicized it with a postcard. And so before the book appeared, I got this postcard in the mail, which had a picture of the cover of the book. And this was, again, before the book had circulated. And I noticed, as often happens with people writing about ancient documents, ancient languages, the cover has 4 images of the letter Aleph. And on the cover, they were upside down. And I remember frantically frantically calling whoever it was at the SBL headquarters and saying, can't do this.
Oh,
Any professor is going to take a look at this and say, this has no credibility at
oh
all.
my goodness.
Kind enough to mail me a copy of that first printing. So I owned and then they destroyed the rest.
Oh,
So I think I own the only copy of this book that has the cover with upside down olives on it.
wow. Good catch.
It was.
Oh my goodness. Well, so what an exciting thing to be able to hear about the background to how you came to Aramaic basically in your education, as well as then became a textbook writer, and then all of the other background. Well, so as we close today, what would you like to say to our viewers about the value of learning Aramaic?
I think its value is in exactly what I've tried to describe. Obviously, the amount of Aramaic in the Hebrew Bible, kind of strange to call it a Hebrew Bible,
Yes.
when there's parts in Aramaic, are very limited. Okay, so I mean, it's not like there's a lot of material in biblical Aramaic anywhere. At the same time, I think that understanding biblical Aramaic can open an awful lot of doors. Just to go in more or less chronological order, I think if you're interested in the Hebrew Bible, for example, you can understand biblical Hebrew better by seeing the context, by having something to compare it with that's very related. It's been pointed out now many times that the different books of the Bible were clearly written, if you will, or created at different times over a span of, maybe a millennium, from, let's say, Moses to Daniel. And languages change over time. And so by knowing Aramaic, you can spot more readily those changes. Similarly, it's been pointed out that different, just like as you've experienced, people in different parts of the United States speak English differently. So Boston is very different. Boston English is different from San Francisco English. You're now living in Florida. When I lived there, there were a lot of New Yorkers. So New York English is very different from, let's say, Alabama English. Similarly, it's been pointed out there are different dialects of biblical Hebrew. And by being aware of a related language, you can become more sensitive to that. So I think understanding a second language that's related to biblical Hebrew can help you not only be able to read, the books of Daniel and Ezra in the original, but also have a better sensitivity to what's going on in other parts of the Bible. Certainly when you turn to the New Testament, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but my impression is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Jesus probably spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew.
Right.
He certainly didn't speak Greek. So there are parts of the New Testament, I would think, which make a lot more sense if you know the Aramaic background that's coming from. Certainly, there are rabbinic documents that are filled with Aramaic. Sometimes the Talmud, for example, one sentence will be in Hebrew and then the next sentence will be in Aramaic, and then it'll switch back to Hebrew. There are the Targumim and so on and so forth. So,
yes.
So Aramaic has that value, and biblical Aramaic is certainly a good and a very common place where people start. And then I would add the ancient Near East in general. There's lots of documents we have that were written in Aramaic. And so if you want to understand those cultures on their own, or if you want to understand how they interacted with, let's say, the ancient Israelites, Aramaic can be very valuable in that. And finally, I would say learning several languages is always helpful. It's helpful in understanding your own language, and it is helpful in understanding whatever language you're focused on. Just to close with an example, I mentioned that when I moved to Florida, the only place they could figure to put me was in a language department. I'd never been in a language department before. But I learned a tremendous amount. This was after the textbook was written, by teaching classes. They would have me teach what's called historical linguistics. It's the equivalent of what, when I was in school, we called comparative Semitics.
Yes.
I learned a tremendous amount by hearing students. I would always have the students do presentations about their own languages, whatever they were. And I learned a lot from hearing people talk about how Italian developed, how Spanish developed, Native American languages, Chinese, Arabic, whatever it might be. And I would hear students say, well, this happened in such and such a language. And I would think, oh my goodness, same thing happened in Hebrew. Or, oh my goodness, the same thing is happening in English. So I understand the language I was born into, and I understand the language that I teach and focus on much better by having heard about other languages. So I think simply learning another language, and in this case, one that is presumably related to the language people already know,
Yes.
Can be invaluable.
Yes. Wow. Well, love everything we've been able to talk about today. Thank you so much for your time. This was so such a valuable subject to be able to talk about, because where else can you go to be able to hear about Aramaic and a scholar's journey through it in just a short period of time? So
thank you very much, Scott.
Yes, thank you.